to Mensa at Cambridge by invitation. She's lectured at other times at Cambridge, but everybody knows what Mensa is. And if you're invited to lecture by Mensa, which is, of course, very, very elite intellectually, it says something about your abilities. But Hilary her interest, her main research interest, is in early Greek iconography, and she is an expert on in that field. And I think in this lecture, hear some of her insights. So we'd like to welcome Hilary once more. Thank you very much. Please turn off anything.
Well, good morning, Cape Town, and thank you very much for inviting me back to talk about something which is very close to my heart. And first of all, I think a government health warning. Just about everything I say today will be completely politically incorrect because we're going back to the ancient Greek world. And the ancient Greeks believed that competition builds character. Competition builds character. And as you reduce competition, so you weaken the character of the people, and you weaken the weak, and you also weaken the strong. So it was a very competitive society. They were agonies. And you probably think agonies sound a little bit like agonies, which is quite right. It was agonies. So it's an society. And the country. This is very important, the very concept of teams, which lead to things like football hooliganism, which finally lead to nationalism, which are then what's that? Is it too? Are you okay? Can you all hear me? Sorry, I'm just going on as if you can. Right, it's a nice warm little class, so it should be fine. The thing is so deep. It leads to things like football hooliganism. Are we going to get it right? Up a bit, down a bit. Is that good? Can you not hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. Okay. It's probably too loud now. Microphones in ancient Greece. Now it seems that it's a bit too loud. Right, can you hear me now? Right. Okay, let's just leave it at that because we're wasting time. Thank you. If you want to sit down. So, where was I trying to say this? The concept that competition builds character, that's a crucial idea, and that almost everything is subject to competition. They had competitions for absolutely everything, which made it what we call an agonistic society. Agon meaning competition. And the way you competed was you competed for yourself. That was to avoid the concept of teams. Because when you have teams, you have football hooliganism. When you have football hooliganism, it leads to nationalism. Nationalism can lead to world wars. There was no teaming. I'm going to find my feet in a minute. I've been a bit distracted by what's been going on. But let's not mind. Let's just see if we... Now, this is our wonderful Dame Kelly Holmes, who is a great track athlete. She still holds 3 world records. She won 4 golds, and we all love her to bits. However, she would never have been present at the ancient Olympic Games. One is that there were no women participants in the Games. She would never have gone around with a flag of GB. Can't turn the lights off. We're going to have to be very imaginative. Kelly would never have appeared in the ancient games for a whole host of reasons. And she certainly would never have been part of Team GB, because there was no Team Athens or Team Corinth or Team Sparta. She wouldn't have gone around with any sign of nationalism like the national flag. When we look at the ancient games, we'll see there were no medals at all. You couldn't go for gold. There wasn't a gold. There wasn't a gold or a silver or a bronze. There were no, as I said, no national teams. There were no women competitors. There were no monetary prizes. There was no drug taking. There were no endorsements. And no golf, no tennis, no cycling, or any sport that wasn't useful in war. And no, above all, wonderful, absolutely no. When you went, you had to expect to die, and in fact, a lot of people did. So, and most of all, no wars anywhere. All wars ceased during the period of the games. I'll sort of go into this a bit more later on. So where is Olympia? Well, it's down here. This is the Peloponnesos, and there's Athens. So Corinth, Athens, Delphi, and there's Olympia right down there, and Sparta down there. So let's go back to the 8th century BC. Let's go back to the beginning of the emergence from a dark age. I mean, we think of the dark ages as being something that happened between late antiquity and the Middle Ages. That's the dark ages, right? But there was a very profound dark age between the great dazzling civilizations of the Minoans and of the Mycenaeans and the ancient Greeks. And during that dark age, even written language disappeared. Everything. Imagine how profound for written language to go. It could happen to us. It could really happen to anybody. So here we are, looking over the Aegean, and we see rosy-fingered dawn rises over the sea. Homer, whoever he was, had composed his great poems, but they were not written down for 300 years. So we're in that period, emerging from that dark age. And it is therefore no surprise that the foundation of the games was sacred. There was in ancient Greece an immense cognizance of the presence of a spiritual force in life. That meant that religious observance didn't happen in somewhere. It happened everywhere, all around you. You washed your hands before you crossed a river. Because, it was a sense of something being all around you. So the foundation of the games was originally sacred, and it started with a race towards an altar with a fire on it and away again around a loop like that. And that replicated the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun. In other words, it was about something very deeply sacred. And the sun, of course, was a god. The sun was Helios, and you see him here on this red figure vase, driving a quadriga up into the sky. So if you can imagine way back in that 776 BC, the very earliest games, being surrounded by a great deal of prayer and religious observance, which is something that definitely doesn't happen in our games. Up on Mount Olympus, it's shrouded with mists and rain, and it's grey and it's cold, and up there live the immortal gods, the Olympian gods, led by, of course, Zeus. So Zeus is the head of the gods, and here you see him in an archaic seated figure, and he has, sadly, only half his thunderbolt. The rest of it would have been here. So Zeus is the great god of all, and he is the god of the Olympic Games. I'll tell you more about him a bit later on. So down on earth then, there's man, human beings. What are we? We're nothing. But we aspire to be godlike. we aspired to be made in the image of Apollo. And you're looking at one of the most exquisite hollow bronzes from the 6th century. He's called the Piraeus Apollo. I mean, bronze casting is an immensely complicated process, and the levels, the height to which bronze carving achieved in the 6th century BC was simply unbelievable. He's poised, he's calm, he's confident. The light falls on his high brow and his straight nose. His chest is full of air, and he's holding the little bit of a whip, which tells us that he was probably a charioteer. Of course, he's naked. I'm going to talk about this shamelessly through the whole talk, probably. He was very lucky that he got drowned in the harbour at Piraeus, because his cousins and his brothers and sisters got melted down to make weapons. Imagine the barbarity of the moment when you put that into a kiln to melt. And that's why he's got all this green on him. So man wished to be made in the image of the god Apollo, and to do that you had to work at it by means of going to the Pailestra every day, or the gymnasium. And it's interesting that athletics has the same root as the word athla, which means suffering, which tells you straight away that it wasn't a question of getting into your black lycra and putting on your headsets and going down to the park at 7 in the morning to meet your personal trainer. Nothing like that. It was hard, it was painful, and it was suffering. And you're looking at a very beautiful classical figure, which sadly did suffer the fate of being thrown into a kiln, and therefore what you're looking at is a Roman copy of the original bronze. But athletics really defined the nobility of the Greek male. Going to Pailestra was something everybody did, every aristocrat, all the patricians, every day. It didn't matter if you were old or young or middling, and everybody trained naked in the sand. And the thing was, you were training for one deep purpose, apart from what I mentioned, was to be fit to fight. The fitter you were, the more likely you were to stay alive in battle. Right? It's too loud. Okay. Down. Is that better now? Okay, sorry, it's too loud. Down a bit. Is that okay, or not picking up at all now? Hard to know. I'm sorry. Is that still too loud? Very difficult to get it right. Okay. Athletikos was the same root of suffering. And I wanted, before we really get into the games, to give you some sense of some of the values of the ancient Greeks, which after all were the great drivers behind these great games. So one then was this idea that you had to work at it, you had to suffer, you had to be fit to fight, and while achieving that you also achieved beauty, as you can see from these marvelous figures. Another quality was Andrea. Andrea is manly courage. You achieved manly courage. You got thrashed in the Pailestra. A boy a bit bigger than you thumped you. And you had to learn to win, but you also had to learn to lose. You had to learn to be controlled. You had to have this Greek quality, soufrosune. There is a test at the end of this, by the way, all these Greek words. Soufrosune means control. A real man controls. He has the power. He has to have the power, but he has to control the power. And if you look at the head of this figure, you'll see he's got long hair, and the long hair is plaited very tightly around his head in a plait. And the Greeks had a way of proclaiming the manliness and alleged by Herodotus before the battle. So, also this face is calm and poised. It's not arrogant. It's not smiling. It's simply what it is. And the chest here is full of the pneuma theo, which is the bread of God. Well, the thing was, there was a purpose to it all, which was to make sure that the barbarians did not overwhelm Greece. And in even the most rudimentary ancient history tells you that the Persian Empire, which included many, many allies, was all set on crushing Greece out of vanity. The great king wanted to crush Greece because it was so small, and it was so cheeky, and it was so impertinent, and it got up his nose. So this is the inside of a plate, and you can see that the barbarian or the Persian is shown, or the Scythian, in completely different clothes. He wore a sort of stripy catsuit. And one of the reasons that the Greeks despised the barbarians was that no great Persian noble, however great he was, and they were great, would ever go anywhere without his personal makeup artist and his high heels. And of course they went into battle wearing jewelry. And they wore these extraordinary different costumes. Some of the allies would wear horses' heads. And when the Athenians saw them for the first time at Marathon, wow, that was frightening. So here we have a Greek hoplite thrashing a Persian, and you'd get to that after you drunk your huge big jug of wine. So the whole concept of gymnos, I said I'd come back to it. That's for everybody. Gymnos means naked, because of course they were naked when they trained in the gym, in the palestra. This is, I've called him a snake-waisted fashionista from the archaic age. And when you see him straight away, you'll notice his attitude is balanced, the weight is evenly on both feet, elbows slightly bent, hands slightly clenched, and he's looking out at a distant reality, and he is truly a god. He has a perfect figure, a perfect body. You can see he's archaic because he has the tight curls around his head and the curled and dressed hair and the rigid posture. And you will see straight away the Egyptian influence, yes? You can all see that. The early Greek sculptors were trained in Egypt. But also you'll notice, pretty obviously, that he's stark naked. Now, I'm not sure if we're sufficiently relaxed for me to go into any kind of details, but the fact is nudity is a big heroic concept in ancient Greece. And we've not at that stage entered a shame culture of Judeo-Christian culture. There was no shame culture, and a man is what he is. And if I could just make you giggle a bit, the fact is that men were considered to have the same sort of character as their bodies. In other words, everything's open and honest and out there and in the front, and you see what you are and you get what you see and all that. Nice, clear, strong character. Whereas women had their interesting bits tucked away and hidden inside their bodies where you couldn't see it, and that meant they were devious, tricky, and they thought round corners. And that concept, of course, was established in the 7th century by Hesiod in the Theogony, when he invents Pandora, the first woman, who's very beautiful, but deeply treacherous and tricky and ultra manipulative. So the nudity, don't think of it as anything primitive. It was part of their culture. And the other great idea, which I think is great, is that this idea was that you could be kalos, kaiagathos. Kalos is beautiful and agathos is good. And that by somehow becoming beautiful, you would also become good. And that didn't mean just giving something to the Red Cross or something. It meant having a moral character in all situations. The training in the palestra not only made you beautiful, but it gave you the character to be able to make these kinds of decisions in life. So kalos kai agathos, beautiful and good, is a big concept that drove the athletes. And you're looking at probably the most beautiful, amazing marble. He's called the Mocha Charioteer. I am very unhappy about the date of 470, 460, because the head is clearly archaic. You see these tight curls across the forehead, dressed hair, and you see the hint of what's called the archaic smile. The head is definitely archaic, but when I look at the body, I see far too much fluidity and movement to be as early as 470. Right? So it's a difficult one, particularly as the head has been broken off and replaced. So when we look at him like this, we can see this characteristic Contra Posture, which is the swing of the hips and the balance moving from the weight on the one leg, the hip down, the shoulders in one angle and the hip that way, and the head turning toward the shoulder. This is called Contra Posture. I'll just demonstrate. That's your Egyptian model, the archaic model, and then you have like that, which is Contra Posture, and it gets more and more extreme when you get into Byzantine art. Christ figure is shown Contra Posture on the cross, and so on. But when we look at this chariot here, and I get shivers of terror, because to be honest, it was the most dangerous thing you could ever do, was get on a chariot, and he's smiling. He must have won. He could even be North African, slightly, because this was found in the sea off Lampedusa, where the leopard. And you see in here, you see these two holes? Well, probably there was a bronze ring, and what these insane young men did was they took all the reins from 4 great horses, and they tied them to their own body. Right. So they had the hands free, one for the whip and one to... I wanted to show you something about Greek sculpture, which is they had the concept that as you conceal things, so you reveal more. We should learn that in our culture. Everything's out front. In Greek culture, you never ever saw violence on the stage, ever, because it was much more powerful when it was imagined. You saw the consequences wheeled out on a sort of platform called the ekuklemma, but you never saw violence on the stage. The idea of concealing the body in a way that it reveals much more as the ketone flows down the body like water down a mountain stream. An absolutely amazing carving. So all of these great efforts that I'm going to talk to you about were simply for a crown of leaves. There was no money, no monetary rewards, and you can see this young man is crowning himself. The crown is called the Stephanos, Stephanos, and there were 4 great crown games. I feel slightly guilty about this because Olga Palaya thinks these holes were for locks of hair and perhaps not for leaves, but it's debatable. When we look at this figure is in Eleusis, but when we look at that, you can see quite clearly, well, there were leaves stuck in a crown around his head. So there were 4 crown games, and they were all very important. One of which, of course, the most important was the Olympic Games. So the Olympic Games were dedicated to Zeus, and you won an olive leaf crown. The olive leaf was cut with a golden knife by a boy whose both parents were alive from the sacred grove of Zeus. And of course, they were held at Olympia. The Pythian Games were held at Delphi, and there you got a crown of laurel leaves, because laurel was sacred to the god Apollo, to whom the gods were dedicated. And then the Nemean Games, dedicated to Zeus and Heracles, you got a palm frond, or wild celery leaves. And the Isthmian Games at Corinth, dedicated to Poseidon, you got wild celery leaves. So there were these 4 great games. Now, even when Corinth and Athens were at war, in 412, the Peloponnesian Wars were raging, the Athenians were still invited to the Isthmian Games. That gives me a chance to say how important was the concept that all wars stopped during the Games. There was a truce. Sometimes the news of the truce took a bit of time to travel because people didn't have fast communications, and some states or some city-states might have been fighting after the beginning of the Games, which was very bad. But all wars ceased everywhere, which is a big thing that never happens in the modern game. And the athletes came from all these city-states, and when they came, they had to leave all that behind. They were vegetarian at least for the last month. They trained together. They trained at Olympia, and there were lots of rules. They had to abstain from alcohol and all sorts of things because the games were sacred. In addition to the crown games, we've got the Pan-Athenaic Games, founded in Athens by Pisistratus, the tyrant of Athens, and they were dedicated to wonderful, wonderful Athena. Athena, a really great goddess that made Athens very great indeed. So a lot of the evidence we have then would be from the Pan-Athenaic Games because of the Greek pottery painting, the Athenian pottery painting. So the messenger of victory was the Nike. Ha Angelos simply means messenger, and Nike is the victory goddess. And she gives you a palm frond as soon as you win the chariot race, and she gives you a crown. So she looks very like our medieval angel. That was one of the reasons that angels were completely out for 200 or 300 years in the early church, because they so represented, they so looked like victories from the Greek and Roman goal. But you can't keep angels down, and the angels stage a comeback in about the 5th century. So there is Zeus. Now, because people cheat, human nature is a bit flaky. All the athletes, plus their brothers and their trainers and their fathers, all had to make oaths before Olympian Zeus and keep them, with very big consequences if you didn't. So now, who was the founder? How were the games really founded? Well, one idea is it was Heracles. That was a good thing, because Heracles is a pan-Hellenic hero. In other words, the whole of Greece admired him, worshipped him, and he was a hero. And here you see him in his lion skin, and you see the teeth of the lion, and it's a very, very fine vase. You see him holding his club, which is his great piece of iconography, and this is called a bilingual amphora, but don't get worried about that. It just means that each side of the vase, one side was painted red figure and the other side was painted black figure style. But it could have been Pelops. Pelops, after whom the Peloponnesos is named. So Pelops wins a race, like the first famous chariot race, against King Onomaos for the hand of Hippodamia. And you see now lots of suitors have already died, because obviously the king has the best horses. On this occasion, his own daughter got the groom to sabotage her father's chariot, and he crashes and dies. But you can see she's actually looking at some mating pigeons, so she's probably got other things on her mind. Point. So Pelops is going, and you can see on this, the chariot's only got 4 wheels, 4 spokes, and if you lost a spoke, well, you were dead, and that was that. So we don't know, Heracles, Pelops, who knows? It's in the midst of time. But I tried to explain. Could we ask questions at the end, do you think? Because it's hard to concentrate. The bilingual vase is a vase towards the end of the 6th century, when red figure style was used on one side and black figure on the reverse. Sometimes we know when we have 2 different painters who they were. So the original of the funeral games appear in the Iliad. Now, if anybody hasn't read the Iliad, I strongly recommend the Iliad for your summer reading. It's the first novel ever written, and it's still the best. It's incredibly unputdownable. And in the Iliad, of course, the great Patroclus dies. And here we have Achilles binding up the wounds of Patroclus. So the funeral games for Patroclus give us quite a good picture of how the very early games might have been. And the prizes at these games were that the first prize was bronze tripods, very expensive piece of kit. The second prize, bulls, also very valuable. And if you didn't hack it, women, third prize. Now, the thing is, tripods were valuable. I mean, even the god Apollo is slightly upset that Heracles, the great hero, is stealing the Delphic tripod from him at Delphi. So we have this little theme on quite a few vases, which really shows you the bronze tripod is very, very valuable. This is black figure vase from 520. I've tried to label these very thoroughly, but I know you're not going to pick up all the labeling. That doesn't really matter. I've done it for my own sake, that I want to be thorough. Another absolutely beautiful amphora, and this one's also a bilingual, showing again the stealing of the tripod. I'm trying to show you a tripod isn't something you leave in the backyard. It's something very valuable. So the evidence of the games come mostly from vase painting, and we're going to look now at some of the evidence. This is a pan-Athenaic prize amphora, which means it was an amphora given at the pan-Athenaic games, and it's a particular kind of display vase. So it has a small foot and high handles. It's big, and it takes about 42 liters of expensive olive oil. When we get closer, we see they're men. They're all running stark naked. All the athletes were absolutely stark naked, except for the charioteers, which I'll come to when we do chariot racing. And of course, all they wore was the very finest layer of extremely good extra virgin olive oil. So there was no question at all of endorsements of any kind. And when you look at them running, you will see that the arms and legs are going in the wrong direction. You see the arm and leg like that. Nobody runs like that. The reason for that is we want to make quite clear that we show the chest. You see, when you see Heracles fighting something, or you see Achilles killing Penthesilea or something like that, he turns with he raises, which you can see his chest full of the breath of God. So the chest, and of course the other important part that we're not mentioning. So this peculiar running motion was in order to endorse that. And if we look at here Theseus killing the Minotaur, we see exactly the same construction. So anyway, the nakedness of the men led to a very obvious problem, which was the problem of women. And it was solved perfectly simply by simply banning all married women. You really can't trust them. Not when they've got into a relationship. And this woman is definitely either married or engaged, because she's doing what we call a veil-lifting gesture, like that, which is indicative of either being married or engaged. Or I was once in the British Museum doing some talking, some teaching, and my 13-year-old was in tow, and he'd had his first term at public school, and he piped, "Does that mean she's available?" It was such a typical public school boy of 15. So women were not allowed in the games. There's certain lots of stories about women trying to get in, but oddly enough, virgins were. Because, you know, you want them to look over the goods kind of thing. But can you imagine the ticketing at the gate at Olympia? Can you just imagine? You know, you're at the gate at Olympia. Can I see your virginity pass, please, miss? Thank you. Thank you. Your virginity pass, please, miss. Thank you. Like it. So virgins were allowed to go to the games. Parthenon. And there are quite a lot of stories around those sort of things. But primarily, there are only men competing. And one of the great races was the torch race. Now, it wasn't simply about taking the flame to light the sacred flame, as we have. It was about the concept of life being passed on from one life to another. The idea of transmigration of the soul. Remember, that's Plato. Okay, this is long before Plato. But the idea that the torch passed on represents life going on. And you had to arrive with your torch alight. Otherwise, you know, very, very bad indeed. Another one here shows the torch being handed over. And we have one small vase, not a very good illustration, but it shows you that the torch arrives and the sacred flame is now being lit in the presence of Nike. As I told you right at the beginning, there was a flame on the altar right from the earliest days. So one of the big races that we don't have in the modern games is the race in full armor, which is called the Hoplite Aromas. And it was a pretty tough race because you had to run carrying your armor, which was very heavy. At this point, I really need to mention that the biggest difference about the ancient games was that all the sports were skills that would be useful to you in war, that would keep you alive, right? Those were the skills you needed. You needed to be able to run, you needed to be able to throw a javelin, you needed to be able to run with a shield, you needed to wrestle, and all of the skills they had were linked to warfare. Modern games, hardly any of them are. So the hoplite armor was really heavy. Just to give you an idea, the shield itself weighed about 12 pounds, and the spear was 6 to 9 feet long, which made it was extremely heavy. It had bronze on both ends, and this is a very fine amphora by the Berlin painter. So you had to be fit to carry your armor. This just shows a javelin or a spear thrust, showing you how you had to be very powerful. Now, is a very early vase, a polychrome amphora, and you can see that it's not a war scene because the hands are free, they're not holding spears. So this again is the Hoplite Aromas, and you see the prize there, which is the tripod on the side. The games were all over several days, but the toughest of all was the Pankration. So the Pankration had always had an umpire, and it was a full-on, no-holds-barred fight. This is a black figure vase by the Cleophrades. He's very famous painter, and it shows the Pankration in full swing with the umpire with his willow thing, which he could whip them. There were only 2 rules. You see, it's a prize amphora. You can see the small foot, the high handles, and you can see Athena on the back. So basically, there were only 2 rules in Pankration: no biting and no gouging out of eyes. But anything else went, and there were no classes according to weight. And you did quite literally fight to the death. If you raised one finger, they'd stop the fight. But nobody would lose so much face. You know, the battle was, do I die or do I save my life? Many of people would die in these horrendous, bloody battles that went on practically to the death. And you can see here a foul. This is a foul where one of the wrestlers is trying to gouge out the eye, you can see. And you can see that he's looking towards us. Now, the umpire is stopping the fight straight away. But something just a little aside is that the frontal face is quite rare in Greek art. It's quite rare. And it normally denotes a person who is... Do you think you could stop squeaking the chair? It's really squeaking rather badly. Sorry. Just try not to squeak it. Squeaks are... The point is that the frontal face denotes somebody who's losing control, either dying or becoming unconscious or becoming drunk. Satyrs look at you when they're drunk, or sometimes even listening to music. When you listen to music, you can lose control. You know, that's what raves are all about, aren't they? Losing control. So just to show you an example, this is that's a close-up showing the frontal face. And here you see the Minotaur facing frontally. Obviously, he's going to die. So some little stories. The 6th century athlete Milo from Croton in Magna Graecia, Italy, was heroic and legendary as a 6 times victor both at the Olympic and the Pythian Games. But other pancratists achieved absolutely awe-inspiring acts of strength, moving enormous rocks and boulders. They were incredible. There were other sort of devious things going on. Sotades at the 99th festival was victorious in the long race, and he was proclaimed a Cretan, which, in fact, he was a Cretan. But at the next festival, he made himself an Ephesian, being bribed to do so by the Ephesians, and for this act, he was banished by the Cretans. It's a bit like buying a footballer, you know, from another team. So here we come to boxing, an absolutely vicious sport because it was bare knuckle, and the people were very heavy, the boxers. And later on, they wound leather straps around their hands. But when it came to the Romans in the games, the Romans embedded bits of lead in the leather straps. Oh, typical. I mean, I'm sorry, but we don't go there when we're talking about the Romans. I mean, they were great. They ran an empire. They had great administrative ability, and they had a fantastic army, but they just didn't have the soul of the Greeks. No. But anyway, so wrestling, you have to explain to aliens why these men were naked and throwing themselves around in the dust, covered with oil and dusted with a little light dusting of dust, because it was very difficult to wrestle with somebody who was all oily. The pentathletes were obviously the most beautiful boys because their whole bodies were developed, and there were different things. There was the running, the discus, the javelin, the wrestling, and the long jump. And here you see them in a rather nice cup here, and by the carpenter painter, a lovely red figure cup from late 6th century, beautiful cup. And you can see that they are training to music, because you can see the double aulus being played up there. So they're all training naked, as I've already told you. This is a vessel in which you put wine and you put it into water to keep cool, by the Altos painter, and we get a slight closer look at the long jump, which was again a very important one, and you see that he's holding what look like telephone handles, but they're weights. And they're quite extraordinary stories. One story of somebody who could jump 16 meters. I mean, it must have been downhill. How else could he have done it? So we actually have some of these weights. Here's another boy, beautifully poised, ready to start the jump, and he held onto the weights like that. There they are. So it's wonderful that archaeology actually gives us the weights. Now, on the other side, there were also classes for boys, the Pythian class, and here is a boy being given a wreath. He's just one in his class, which is quite exciting. He gets his olive branch. The discus was quite tricky, because if you really fancied yourself as a discus player, you had to indulge in a little deceit and trickery, in a sense, because although everybody took their own discus to the games, they all had to compete with the heaviest one. So they were all weighed, and the heaviest discus is the one that was used, right? So what you had to do, if you were training in Corinth, you had to send a friend sneakily off to Sparta or up to Delphi or up to wherever, or any of the cities, to find out what so-and-so was training with, and preferably get the weight, so that you could train with the same thing. And I'm really interested in the fact that they're with their left hands, both of them. Can't understand why. I don't see any, unless it is this compositional idea, I can't see any reason. You see, this vase should be the other way around, actually. I think it's to show the chest. At the bottom of these drinking vessels, you see they were full of wine. Tomorrow I'm going to tell you all about this. The wine is mixed with water, but as you drink it, you see the image emerging through the wine, slightly wobbly as you drink your wine. And it'll usually be something really rather terrific, like a beautiful young boy, an athlete, a girl, or something like that. So this is from the bottom of a wine cup, and you see this, the words kleomelos is kalos. Kalos, beautiful. And there's one discus, there's another discus. Unfortunately, I haven't got anything to show the scale, but you can see the writing. It was very heavily used. Very quickly onto the chariot racing. The boys, of course, had certain identifying kit. They would have a strigil right here, with which they would scrape off all the oil and sand after training, and an arabalos, which was full of, an arabalos, which was full of oil right there, because they put lovely scented oil, perfume bottle for boys. Young boys, gangly teenagers, obviously chatting in the palestra. They're going on to greatness, obviously. I love this tiny little jug. The boy is obviously practicing his balancing, but I love the way you have light around there to define the head, dark around here, and the balance, and it's really beautiful. So we come to horses. Now here we all get our Kleenexes out and our tissues out, because it's a very weepy subject, because the Greeks simply adored horses. They worshipped horses. And horses were quite simply the most beautiful creatures on God's planet. And this is a lovely early vase showing this horse, of course very exaggerated, but in all his great beauty. The horse was the defining symbol of the equestrian aristocratic classes, and the horses were immensely, immensely expensive. So this one, very early vase here you see, attributed to Acropolis, the paint of Acropolis 606. It's very early, 570. Another one by the Effector painter, how much these horses are exaggerated in their nobility. Now you might call your horse after your child. That might be quite a reasonable thing to do, but the ancient Athenians called their children after their horses. So you've got hippos hippoi horses. You've got Hippeas, who was the son of the tyrant Hipparchus. You've got Hippolytos, Hippodamia, Hippocrates, and Hipparchus, and so on, all with the word hippos in. And, I mean, horses were gods. Can I just give you an idea of the cost of a horse? To buy a beautiful stallion, you would put out the same amount of money that would be needed. Do you remember your aristocrat? You would put up the same amount of money as would be needed to build an entire trireme, that's a warship, plus pay the crew for a year, which includes 200 people, which includes the rowers and the hoplites that fought on the ships. That for a year would be the cost of one great horse. And because they were so precious and valuable, a system of insurance was developed so that if you took your horse into battle, you'd get something. So these horses, and a chariot has 4 horses. So now let's go to chariot racing. Very quickly, there were other equestrian things, throwing javelins, but let's just go to the chariot racing. Chariot racing was quite simply the most dangerous thing anybody has ever invented. The chariots were pulled by 4 of these great stallions or mares. Sometimes they're mares because they didn't fight. And the chariot was very, very small and light and only had 4 spokes in the wheel, and it had no springing. So it was bang, 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 like that. And there was nothing. You had this kind of arm that you could hold on to. As you took corners, you could lean out, but only the 2 center horses were connected by harness. The 2 outside horses simply had one rein from their mouth going back. So these horses had to know each other, they had to work together. And the charioteers were either teenagers or perhaps slaves, and sometimes a very tough son of an aristocrat might insist on driving his father's chariot, which did happen. But chariots or slaves, or teenagers, they had to be tall and young and light and had to look over their heads. And they were the only athletes that wore clothes. So they wore long chiton, which I have thought about a lot. I don't have an answer, except that if they were slaves, they would not be shown naked. Nakedness is a heroic feature of the Greek patricians, and they were not that. And also because the appalling accidents, you wouldn't see the body quite so clearly if it was covered up with something. So we have some stories. Some of the chariot races were as long as 14 kilometers. I mean, I didn't think a horse could gallop for 9 miles. Imagine the length of these races. And of course we have a story of Alcibiades, who's the star of Athens, who he entered 7 chariot teams into one of the great race games, and he won 1st place, 2nd place, and 4th place. Of course, he was the greatest hero of Athens ever. But we do have records of a race where there were 40 chariots entered. So how many horses if it's 40 chariots? How many? Well, you know, Mensah got that wrong. 160 horses. And of the 40 chariots, only 1 finished. So you can imagine the carnage, and the chariot races were just, and of course, they were just terribly white-knuckle. So chariot racing there was a very big thing. There's another one, you see them on the vases. This is a Panathenaic vase from 6th century. You see Athena there. And they also had mule racing, where you sat in a little cart. And later on, they discovered how to do sort of perspective, which is rather sad, because they don't look so powerful as they do. I want to know why Anne and Alan are right at the back and not here, where you can actually see and hear. Can you come down? This is ridiculous. God. Who are you talking about? Yeah, he's not, but this is not a charioteer. He's sitting in a little cart. It's a different kind of race. It's a different sort of race. But it's a good point that you mentioned, because I'm not sure. But this is not the same thing as chariot. It's a bit like there's trotting for horse races. It wasn't the same thing as 4 horses pounding along. Here, of course, the one you're all waiting for, Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur, of course, Roman, Greek horses would never have been saddled with all this stuff. And in this actual film, somebody was killed in the chariot race, I understand. So people died. Here's the death of a charioteer, possibly, and it's called his prothesis, where he's laid out for the days before the funeral, and below you see a chariot race. The most famous charioteer is the chariot at Delphi, the Heniokos, that means chariot, and he was dedicated by a Sicilian tyrant, and his horses and his chariot have lost, unfortunately. But an incredible statue. So we're up at Delphi because Delphi also has these very famous games called the Pythian Game, a beautiful, very mysterious location. Apollo has 2 messages for you, which are still good. One is know yourself, and the other is of nothing too much. And those ideas were written over the doors of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. Know yourself, and of nothing too much. There is the great theatre, because at all the games you also had theatrical things, and in that wonderful amphitheatre He would have had songs and music, and rhapsodes would have recited poetry. And there is the god Apollo, the god of music, of order, of beauty, the far shooter, the great god from the west pediment of the Temple of Olympia. Some musical competitions would have involved instruments we don't have today, which would be the kithara and the double aulos there. And now we see Mount Parnassus, which is right up above Delphi, and the stadium where the Pythian races were held. An amazing piece of engineering, I think. Imagine cutting that out and making it level. And then the starting line, which is still there, where you had to toe the line before you start. So we go down to Olympia, which is a very beautiful, peaceful site, melancholy, as long as there are not too many tourists. It was destroyed completely by earthquakes. As you see, the olives are still growing. So it was destroyed in the late 5th century, and the figure of Olympian Zeus, which is one of the wonders of the world, was transported to Constantinople, where it was destroyed by fire. So the whole site was wrecked by earthquakes. Now, this was the tunnel through which the Olympian athletes had to go, very nervously, in order to compete in front of all the people ranged around the stadium. It was the Emperor Theodosius I think I mentioned him last year when I was talking about the closing down of the Eleusinian Mysteries, if anybody was here last year. And he abolished the Olympic Games in 393 AD. There he is. And now I just want to round up, as I've got a few minutes, luckily, I want to round up by talking about what happens next. First of all, I think you've got the idea. The games were very sacred. People prepared by fasting, by giving up on meat, by training very hard, abstaining from things, coming from all over the Greek world, by obeying rules and by giving oaths. And they accepted no financial rewards or inducements. All of that was a very good thing, and all wars stopped. Now we're going to see what happens when the Olympics are restarted. In 1896, there was a move to restart the Olympic Games in Athens on the 6th of April. It was Easter Monday. And here they are. Now, the first mistake was they introduced sports that were not useful in war, that had nothing whatsoever to do with being a warrior. For example, cycling. And here are the French cycling champions in 1896. Well, actually, I don't think they've got brakes, so they were quite brave. It looks like they've got fixed cog. Also, at the first Olympics, it was thought unseemly for women to compete. There were no women competing in the ancient Olympics. But by the first of the modern Olympics, but by 1932 they were, and this is a sort of tremendous British woman throwing herself over hurdles. But it's really interesting, as we come to 1936, I couldn't leave this out, although I did think about it. We have the Berlin Olympics. And, things were already very clear to most people, even though there was a policy of appeasement in England. And you had America and France and Britain all saying that they would boycott the Games. There is Adolf Hitler, the Führer, taking the salute, the Hail Victory salute. Well, at these games, the Americans did go. And they sent somebody called Jesse Jones. Now, Jesse Jones, it's amazing how modern this picture looks because it's now a photograph. He was allegedly the grandson of a slave, and he took home 4 gold medals in one day in the running races and the long jump. And when he was on the podium in first place, he very bravely refused to give the Hail Victory salute, and he just gave the ordinary American salute. And the Japanese, who came second in all these, refused utterly to salute. So it's really quite interesting historically. And then we come to 1948. So 1948 is the first London Olympics, and you see this. You see the important thing in the Olympic Games is not winning, but taking part. the essential thing